in order to find the one that is actually the target. Next, we'll talk about where attention happens in the brain. One thing we know about attention is that it tends to prime brain regions that are needed to perform a specific task. For example, if somebody's engaging in a visual attention task, then we will see portions of the visual cortex become more active prior to engaging in the actual task. Similarly, if somebody knows that they are going to have to listen for a particular stimulus, let's say we are waiting for a particular auditory stimulus to be presented, we may see part of the auditory cortex become more active as we are waiting for that stimulus to be presented. Attention also engages brain regions in the parietal and frontal regions that are known to control allocation of attention. We'll talk about those in just a few moments. Shulman et al. Performed a series of experiments that demonstrated these two different types of attentional resources in the brain. In this task, participants were cued to look for motion in an upcoming stimulus, or were given a passive cue, in which case they were told there was no particular task that they had to perform. So, when participants were given a directional cue, during a time period before the stimulus was presented, they were waiting to look for a particular direction of motion amongst several dots that were presented on the screen. In the passive cue example, they were just told to wait and not provide any particular response whether motion was present or not. Shulman measured bold fMRI response activity during the period where the participants were waiting for the onset of the stimulus. In this case, what Shulman was measuring was whether there was some differential response in the brain when participants were primed for a stimulus, but before the stimulus was presented. Shulman found that when there was a directional cue and participants were primed to wait and look for a particular direction of motion, two brain areas became active. One of these was MT, or the medial temporal cortex. Medial temporal is known to be involved in the processing of motion. Shulman interpreted this as the fact that that brain region was primed to see motion even before the motion was presented, because the participant knew that they were responsible for reporting if motion was going to be presented there. In the parietal lobe, Shulman also observed increased activity. This is interpreted as being due to the fact that participants knew that they had to activate the medial temporal lobe, and that the parietal lobe is involved in such endogenous attentional control. In other words, the parietal lobe is not actually doing the processing, but is controlling which portion of the brain are doing the processing and therefore require more attention. The frontal eye fields in the frontal lobe are also involved in attentional control. In this case, they are thought to be involved in exogenous attentional control, when a stimulus draws one's attention and one moves their eyes to that location. The frontal eye fields, or FEF, contain something called a retinotopic map that can be seen on the right. In a retinotopic map, locations on the retina and the direction between those locations are preserved in the cortex. So, for example, if we were to look at this region over here in the retina and a nearby region on a different location of the retina, we would find that in the cortex, these two locations are nearby one another, and in fact are in a similar spatial organization, although in this case inverted. You may recall that the image on the retina ultimately is an inverted map of the location in the real world, and the brain seems to do something quite similar by inverting those directions in the retina. This kind of retinotopic map means that our brain has access to the basic spatial location of where stimuli are taking place in the environment. The frontal eye field has the property that when it is activated in monkeys, it will actually cause the eye to move to the location that is mapped based on that location in the cortex. In other words, when that particular portion of the brain is stimulated, it tends to draw attention to that location in the world. This suggests that the frontal eye fields are involved in exogenous attention. When the brain stimulates that location, then that draws the eyes and therefore attention to that location in the world. Next, we'll talk about some deficits of attention. One of the best known deficits of attention is attention deficit disorder, which is most often diagnosed as a component of attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD. This disorder is most commonly diagnosed in children and is known to be associated with an inability to stay focused on a central task. In other words, people with ADHD or ADD will often allocate attentional resources or processing resources to tasks that are outside their endogenous control. Evidence supports that this ability to be distracted is likely due to the frontoparietal network that we were just discussing in the previous experiment. A breakdown or deficit in this frontoparietal network leads to a lack of ability to maintain processing resources on the central task and not allocate them towards other tasks that need to be suppressed. In a study of ADHD and the effects on attention, Durston et al. Presented a go-no-go task. The go-no-go task involves the participant having to produce a certain response, such as a button press, whenever a certain stimulus is presented. Most of the times, that stimulus will be presented and the participant will have to press the button. However, on some trials, they may be presented by that stimulus or a similar one and then be given the instructions to not respond. In other words, in a go-no-go task, most of the time, the participant is supposed to produce a response, but on certain trials is supposed to suppress that response. Durston et al. Found that children who have ADHD completed more errors by pressing the button even though it was a no-go stimulus. In addition, using fMRI, they found that these participants who had ADHD had reduced activity in the frontoparietal regions that we know are involved in endogenous attentional control. Another deficit of attention is Balin syndrome, which occurs when brain damage due to a stroke or some other brain injury simultaneously affects both the occipital and parietal lobes of both hemispheres. Balin syndrome is fairly rare because damage to both hemispheres in the same locations, fortunately, does not happen all that often. Patients with Balin syndrome suffer from optic ataxia, which is the inability to execute visually guided movements. So, because the occipital lobe is damaged, this damages and prevents proper visual function, which ultimately leads to reduced ability to move one's eyes to the appropriate location where the person wants to direct their attention to. Another deficit is called simultanagnosia, which is the inability to identify more than one object or property at a time. For example, if a simultanagnosic patient was looking at the image on the right, they may be able to identify individual objects, such as a piece of fruit or a flower. However, it's likely that they would not be able to identify the entire image as consisting of a collection that looks like a person. This is sometimes referred to as sticky attention. Visual neglect patients typically have damage to their right parietal lobe. Because the brain is organized contralaterally, the right parietal lobe takes in information from the left visual field. Patients who have visual neglect will often forget about the left visual field or neglect it. So, for example, in the image that you see here, the patient's copy of the images will often be missing details from the left side. In general, when people have damage to their left visual field, to the left hemisphere and left parietal lobe, they do not show similar neglect of the right visual field. And this is understood to be due to the fact that the right visual field is processed in terms of attention by both the right and left hemispheres. Neglect is not a problem for perception. Instead, it is a problem of attention. If somebody points out the missing locations in the picture, a visual neglect patient will identify them and be able to correctly notice that information is missing. However, without something drawing their attention, their own brain does not draw their attention to that location. Finally, autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is also known to have some attentional components. Autism is generally thought of as being due to atypical brain development during early childhood, or even in utero. However, the cause is still unknown. Autism leads to deficits in language, social behaviors, and sometimes repetitive actions, as well as general delays in cognitive development. A hallmark of autism, one that is often noted by other people when interacting with people with ASD, is a reduced tendency to fixate on other people's eyes. Pelfrey et al. Found that individuals with autism were often less successful at identifying other people's emotions. One theory is that this may be due to the fact that people with ASD do not fixate on the typical locations that other people do on somebody's face that they're interacting with. If this takes place throughout the course of development, children with ASD are less likely to learn the kinds of emotional content that are expressed in people's faces. Therefore, one possibility is that the attentional deficits or differences in ASD may lead to differences in how they process emotion and other social cues.